it looks like it is already having an impact on people who are considering buying Russian oil, such as India, and that will dent Russia's economic war chest. But it really, more than anything, it is a political symbol, and a very interesting political symbol from the White House, that actually it is not going to sit by and tolerate Russian intransigence forever. And if Putin is not prepared to come to any kind of peace talks, then the US does have cards it can play. And this is particularly interesting because for all of the rhetoric, the backwards and forwards, the flip-flopping that Donald Trump has made since he took over, this is really the first meaningful new action that he's taken against the Russians. So I think the Ukrainians will be very glad to see that.
Hello, welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot, and this time we're joined by Maxim Tucker. Maxim is the Times Ukraine Correspondent, and he's been reporting from the front lines in Ukraine since 2022. Hi, Maxim, good to see you again. And you are recently back from Ukraine, and there are developments along the parts of the front line where you reported from. Just bring us up to date on Dobropillia, southwest of Pokrovsk. What was happening when you were there, and what's changed since you left?
So when I was there, we broke this story about the Ukrainians led by the Azov Corps encircling the Russians in 3 points around Dobropillia and cutting off supplies to advanced groups of infantry and then kind of methodically wiping them out. So those 3 pockets were remaining. We now see one of them seems to have been closed with Ukrainian troops raising the flag in Kucherov Yar in that village. So that's the first, the smaller of those pockets. So obviously, the Ukrainians have been able to close the net and squeeze the Russians out. And I think we're hearing some reports about more intensive fighting in that area, as well as the Ukrainians try to close the remaining 2 pockets and squeeze the Russians out of those as well.
When they're actually eradicating the Russians from that area, what is happening to them? Are they taking them prisoner or are they pushing them back?
So the Ukrainians say they've taken 50 Russians prisoner in that first area where they'd encircled a group of them. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of Russians in the 2 remaining larger pockets that they are trying to encircle, trying to cut them off completely now. So, there are choices for the Russians. Either they throw down their arms, they try and break their troops out and fight through the Ukrainian lines to get out, or they will be remaining there with dwindling supplies of food and ammunition and water until they have no choice to surrender, or they are wiped out by the Ukrainian forces.
And can you tell me a bit more about what you know about what is happening around Pokrovsk, somewhat 30-odd kilometres away?
Yeah, so this is all part of the kind of the big push to take Pokrovsk, and the Russians were trying to move up close to Dobropillia in order to encircle Pokrovsk and also break out in the direction of Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, the 2 really big remaining cities that Ukraine holds in the Donbass. So there are Russian troops that have advanced as far as the southern reaches of Pokrovsk city, and we've seen some horrific video recently of Russians shooting Ukrainian civilians near the railway tracks, near the railway station, as some infiltrators seem to have got in there and just shooting at anyone that they can get in, but also some scenes of extraordinary heroism as one guy, a civilian, ran into the fire to carry a woman who'd been shot in the legs out of there.
And are these small scale isolated attacks by the Russians, or is it a symptom of something that's going to be building into a bigger strike, a bigger advance?
The Russians are definitely pushing on Pokrovsk. They still want to take that city. The nature of the war is such now that groups are advancing in small groups, and then they try and concentrate in larger groups. And the Russians that have got into Pokrovsk seem to be using a route that is undercover. They manage to get a few people in there, but then the Ukrainians find them and kill them as soon as they get into Pokrovsk. So this is still, a very tense situation. There are drones obviously everywhere in the streets of Pokrovsk. Ukrainian troops cannot move freely around that city either. So it's pretty intense fighting still there.
And away from the front lines, the civilians are feeling the brunt of Russia's long-range strikes cutting off power. Kyiv has been targeted, Sumy as well, I believe. Where else is feeling the brunt?
I mean, the Russians are continuing their campaign. Every autumn now they are doing this. They are hitting Ukrainian energy infrastructure across the country in a bid to methodically reduce power to each city. There'll be large scaled attacks on one city at a time, hitting infrastructure and causing blackouts, causing water to stop running, and really making it difficult for the Ukrainians to guarantee their civilian population have heat and energy and running water. This is something that Ukrainians should have been prepared for, but they are running out of air defense missiles, particularly with these massive attacks now. We see hundreds of Shahed drones used in tandem with ballistic missiles, which are really difficult to stop. And that is why Ukraine has been asking again and again for more Patriot missiles from the US Trump administration.
And what's your assessment of how resilient Ukraine is to withstand these onslaughts throughout the winter?
Well, I think that the ballistic missiles are the big problem here, because the only system that they have that can stop ballistic missiles are the Patriot missile systems. And if those Patriots are not supplied with ammunition, if they're not getting enough missiles to defend against the ballistic missiles, then they're always going to hit their targets. And that, especially when they're such big targets as energy facilities. So that is the thing that Ukraine is struggling with. The second factor is these huge waves of Shahed, which are overwhelmed defenses. The Ukrainians are developing their own defenses against that. They've got quite good interceptors, which are shooting down, bringing down, like flying up and intercepting and bringing down the Russian Shaheds. But it's going to be very, very difficult winter, I think, this one. They don't have the same degree of support that they could count on from the US before. And really, those Patriots and those NASAM missiles are absolutely vital for their defense of their cities.
How, you have the benefit of getting the perspective from both inside and outside Ukraine. How do you see the state now of the diplomatic battlefield? Is it as stuck as the ground war?
Well, it's an interesting forum, isn't it? The diplomatic battlefield. I mean, you kind of get whiplash this week looking at what the US administration has been doing, how Donald Trump changes his mind. One minute he's having a call with Putin and he's on board with the Russian plan to take over the whole of Donbass, shouting at Zelensky, and the next minute he's implementing sanctions. So it's really difficult to figure out what's going on there. But I think, what probably has played a role here is that the European countries have come together, and probably this idea of Putin meeting Trump on European Union soil must have been absolutely abhorrent to European leaders, that Putin would set foot on EU soil for the first time since 2022. And they have pushed back, I imagine, pretty hard against the US on that circumstance.
And we have had obviously the announcement of the sanctions against two of Russia's largest oil companies by the US, Rosneft and Lukoil. How optimistic are you about that? And what needs to follow for it to become some kind of lasting leverage?
Well, I think those are significant things that will have impact on Russia and Russia's economy. I mean, it won't bring Russia's economy to its knees, but it looks like it is already having an impact on people who are considering buying Russian oil, such as India, and that will dent Russia's economic war chest. But it really, more than anything, it is a political symbol, and a very interesting political symbol from the White House, that actually it is not going to sit by and tolerate Russian intransigence forever. And if Putin is not prepared to come to any kind of peace talks, then the US does have cards it can play. And this is particularly interesting because for all of the rhetoric, the backwards and forwards, the flip-flopping that Donald Trump has made since he took over, this is really the first meaningful new action that he's taken against the Russians. So I think the Ukrainians will be very glad to see that.
And as we're speaking, Maxim, Putin has issued his response to all of this, claiming that these sanctions won't make a difference, calling it an unfriendly act. If this is, in fact, a breakup between Trump and Putin, it presumably is going down very well in Kyiv.
Well, I think it will be very welcome news that the US has finally started to take some meaningful action. It's not just words. It will be hopeful that this will be followed up by more military support. I mean, that's what I think Ukraine really needs now. It needs that military support. Russia has had a long time to prepare for sanctions. It's also one of the byproducts of these sanctions is that it has immediately increased the price of oil. So that is going to be actually beneficial in some ways to the Russian economy. It is a problem that is really difficult to solve and really difficult to know where the Ukrainians go next. But perhaps some of the answers lie in this forthcoming meeting that Trump is going to have with the president of China.
Yeah, I'll ask you about that in a moment. And we're speaking on Thursday, and the Coalition of the Willing is meeting in London tomorrow, Friday. What additional leverage do you think they can or should exert on Putin?
Well, I think all the leverage that they have tried to exert on Putin so far has failed, and really, I think what the Europeans are trying to do now is trying to exert leverage on Trump to try and get him to join into this coalition of the willing, or at least be as permanently on side and send a clear, united signal to Putin. And I think the timing of these two sanction packages, the European sanctions package and following on from the US sanction package, is meant to show a clear and united front. And what the Europeans are doing now is presenting their idea for how a ceasefire can be achieved in Ukraine using some of the things that Trump put forward in his Gaza peace plan. And that's kind of, a flattery essentially of Trump that, it seems to be quite effective. So maybe that will be something that Trump will look at and think, oh, maybe I can get behind this plan because it looks something that I was championing earlier in Gaza.
And on the Russian assets, which Europe wants to release the 140 billion euros from the frozen Russian assets to keep going for 2 to 3 years. Where is that money most needed, do you think, and how much of difference can it make?
Well, I think the way that Ukraine has been spending money from the European Union so far has been to allocate it mostly to civilian needs. So, rebuilding energy infrastructure, building roads, making sure there are enough hospitals and schools and that they're running. And then it has devoted much of its own budget to weapons procurement, and it has also devoted some US funds to weapons procurement. So, I would expect Ukraine to allocate it in a similar way. I mean, we've seen Ukraine now trying to get more and more foreign investment in its defense sector. There are lots of Western companies now interested in Ukraine's defense sector because its military technology is beginning to outstrip that of the West. It is battlefield tested drones, new software with AI targeting, things that have been tested to defeat Russian electronic warfare jamming capabilities. And all of that is looked at with great interest by European defense companies. So I think Ukraine can be quietly confident that it's going to generate some investment in that sector, and it's not going to necessarily get the same kind of humanitarian assistance in other areas of the budget.
An opinion piece by the Kyiv Independent is entitled "Europe is time to be brave and start with the Russian assets." It also says, though, it wants a bolder commitment from NATO, not if there's a ceasefire, but before then. It's calling for fighter jet sorties to secure the skies, training in country with battalion, if not brigade level forces. Is this just wishful thinking, do you think, at this stage?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it is wishful thinking because I think we're still quite far away from the Europeans being ready and willing to risk a all-out war with Russia. But it does make a lot of sense. And we've got to the point now where Russia is clearly intransigent about its attitude towards Ukraine. A ceasefire is never going to solve these problems. We keep going back to solving the root cause of the conflict, which is Ukraine being an independent and sovereign nation. That's not what Russia wants. So I think you'd have to start seeing if if the conflict in Ukraine is going to be solved, you need the US and the EU to start saying, well, Russia, if you're not going to accept peace talks, this is what we're going to do, step 1, step 2, and step 3. And those will be military measures, not only sanctions, which, the Russians have managed to shrug off so far. But yes, we will, step 1, start shooting down drones and start shooting down missiles which cross west of the Dnipro, for example. We're going to have air policing missions. We will start training Ukrainian soldiers in country. We will provide these number of weapons, long-range fire capabilities to Ukraine, and it's step by step by step. I mean, that is the language of force, I'm afraid, that Putin understands, and everything else in diplomacy and geopolitics, he thinks he can just outlast Europe.
Mm. President Zelensky has hailed President Trump's compromise to stop the fighting at the current lines as a good one, and Putin will never agree to this, will he? Isn't and you said earlier what Ukraine really needs is military equipment, military assistance right now, weapons. What would make a difference? What do they need the most?
But I think we can see that they need air defences very badly. The problems with energy infrastructure had gone away for a time because they had good air defense supplies, and they're really running out of those now. So Patriot missiles, NASAM missiles, Iris-T missiles, all of those expensive and difficult to procure and difficult to supply. But that's what Ukraine really, really needs. I mean, it also needs to be striking the things that launch those Iskander missiles, striking Russian production facilities. So it does need those long-range fires. It needs things like the Tomahawk, but it doesn't look like it's going to get them. I mean, it needs support, intelligence support for its own long-range deep strike drone program, which has been very effective against Russian oil refineries and gas depots. It needs further support for that. And I think it needs some investment in the kind of amazing innovations that they have developed themselves on the battlefield, but have been so far unable to scale up in the way that the Russians can.
And when it looked like Donald Trump was considering sending Tomahawks to Ukraine, Putin picked up the phone almost immediately. And when Ukraine reported using Storm Shadow missiles to attack a chemical plant in Russia this week, the Kremlin accused Washington of sanctioning an act of war. I mean, long-range strikes won't decide the war, will they? But they can have consequences on the battlefield.
It will definitely have consequences on the battlefield, and it will reduce Russia's ability to produce missiles and armaments. This Storm Shadow strike was on a major chemical facility which helps produce ammunition and rocket fuel, and that will have an impact on the battlefield. It's not going to be decisive, and one of the things that we've seen is that just giving a new piece of equipment is not decisive, especially if you don't give enough of it. So, one of the things that the US and the EU could do differently is when they do give a new piece of equipment, they give a lot of it to make a surge of it to make a big difference on the battlefield for the time that it's effective. And that has not happened throughout the course of the war. Everyone is very, very afraid of escalation. And the Russian response is perfectly targeted in order to make people more afraid of escalation. Say they're talking about this as an act of war. That's something that immediately makes the US, the EU worried that they're now in a kind of direct confrontation with Russia, which they still very much want to avoid.
President Zelensky told a press conference that China is neither interested in Ukraine winning the war nor Russia losing. Is he right? And how influential could China be in ending the war? And how important and what will you be looking for from the meeting between President Trump and Xi next week?
I think President Zelensky is using a diplomatic euphemism there. I mean, China is interested in Russia winning this war, or at least continuing this war. It keeps NATO occupied in Europe while China has designs on Taiwan, and it prevents anyone challenging its supremacy in the Pacific. So I think that China is a key actor here, and there are things that the US and the EU could and should be doing to try and drive a wedge between Russia and China. It should be using its economic clout and threat of sanctions against China, and treating China as if it is the active role in this conflict that it actually does. We have reports of Russian drone factories being assembled and Russian drones being built in China. There's increasing reports of Chinese materiel ending up on the battlefields of Ukraine in Russian hands. And obviously China is a huge buyer of Russian oil and gas products. And China is essentially keeping Russia in this war. If that was to stop, I think the calculation would be incredibly difficult, incredibly different for Putin. So I think if Trump is serious about ending this war, he needs to be offering China some carrots and some sticks in order to back away from Russia.
And just finally, Maxim, two Ukrainian journalists, Olena Gramova and Yevgen Karmazan from Freedom Media, have been killed by a Russian drone in Kramatorsk. Obviously, a tragedy for their friends and their family. How much more dangerous, in your experience, has reporting this war become in the 3.5 years that you've been doing so?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a sad reminder of how dangerous it is. Killed by a Lancet drone, which in a place where Kramatorsk is by no means safe, but you wouldn't consider it a frontline area necessarily. It is a space where there are headquarters and places where you would go and visit, and there are still a lot of civilians in that city. So it's a troubling reminder of nowhere that you go that's anywhere near the front is safe, and the range of drones is increasing. Also, the fact that the Russians are prepared to use quite a sophisticated drone like the Lancet on an ordinary civilian vehicle in that area suggests that they have enough munitions to expend. I mean, clearly, it was a targeted strike on that red civilian car. And it sends a worrying signal to other journalists that, are we, it's always that, the thing that's in the back of your mind, are we being targeted by the Russians deliberately because we are journalists, or do journalists just get unlucky sometimes? And there have been so many journalists killed in this war that often you end up thinking that it is the journalists that are being deliberately targeted.
But you're going to go back?
Yeah, I'll be going back soon. Yeah.
Well, keep safe. Thank you very much, Maxim Tucker, for that. Look forward to seeing your next reports. And thank you for spending some time with us on Frontline.
Thanks very much, Kate.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.